1 Corinthians chapter 6. Having seen that the brethren at Corinth were often filled with strife, envy, and divisions, and that Paul frequently describes them as being puffed up, it is not surprising that they were also guilty of the fault which Paul deals with in this chapter. That is, the problem of litigation or taking the believers or brethren to court before other unbelievers. With an expression of shock and disbelief, Paul instructs them through a series of questions designed to help them see how absurd and wrong such a thing was. I want to show you 5 arguments that Paul places against believers taking other believers in lawsuits. Number 1, Paul says, as believers, you are flaunting your failures. Outsiders are quick to pounce on the inconsistency in the church or in a Christian. Paul says in verse number 1, does any one of you dare, when he has a matter of complaint against another, to go to law before unrighteous men? Number 2, believers will judge the world and angels. Paul says, do you not know that the saints, the believers, will one day judge and govern the world? Do you not know also that we Christians are going to judge the very angels and pronounce opinion between right and wrong? Please note, 6 times Paul asks these rhetorical questions. Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? It shows how important and how much emphasis Paul laid on this fact. Number 3, believers and their matters should not be judged by non-Christians. If then you do have such cases of everyday life to decide, why do you appoint, Paul says, the unbelievers as judge? Number 4, believers try to gain advantage over one another by taking them or pulling them to the court. Paul says in verse number 7, why the very fact of you having lawsuits with one another at all is a defect. They were concerned most of their time about their own rights. It shows that the way the Corinthians used freedom to claim the rights here and everywhere. The practice of Christians taking one another to court had become a regular habit in Corinth. Number 5, argument number 5, Christians were passing on judgment on other believers. It comes over 40 times in this letter and 8 times in the first 8 verses of this chapter where Paul talks about passing judgments. They were called to be saints, but such betrayal, they were living defeated lives like any pagan. They were actually defrauding one another. Even today, we see many believers partake in doing injustice and defraud other believers in matters of land and property. There is a need for repenting and representing the true calling of the Christian church. Now, Paul gives 2 solutions to the lawsuits problem. Number 1, Paul says Christians should find another fellow Christian to judge their case. In verse number 5, Paul says, I say this to move you to shame. Can it be that there is really not one man among you who is wise and competent enough to decide quarrels between members of the brotherhood? As Jesus said in Matthew chapter 18, they should discuss the matter between individuals, then in small groups, and then they can bring it before the church. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 19, Paul says there must be 2 witnesses. Whenever personal relationship becomes strained within the body of Christ, it is important to identify some important and gifted members and use those gifted members to bring the wisdom of God in the situation which is problematic. The second response of Paul, Christians should allow themselves to be wronged. Christians or believers must allow themselves to be taken advantage of. Paul says not only should a Christian go to court against Christian, he forbids a Christian going to court against another Christian, but also he should be prepared to forgive and suffer loss rather than claim his right at all. There is a time and place for everything. No time is right for Christians to go to court with one another. Ultimately, Paul wants to kill off this litigious spirit that is found in the church of Corinth. Thank you, and God bless you.